world.
The personal drinking question, or the frequency question, is the best predictor of current risk for problems from current drinking.
How authorities in the US can determine the future risk of alcohol abuse in children by simply asking two questions. And pregnancy with poverty. Girls fall out of the education system in Kenya.
The issue of people dropping out of school, especially girls, has been brought out by the factor of poverty, which is affecting almost all families.
We'll also take a look at the looming crisis in Zimbabwe as the food begins to run out again. Hello and welcome to The World. I'm Tim Stackpool. Thanks for your company. But first, a new UN report on HIV/AIDS shows 2011 was a game-changing year for the AIDS response. The report released in Geneva on Monday reveals that new HIV infections and AIDS-related deaths have fallen to the lowest levels since the epidemic's peak. Aditya Mehta spoke to Paul Delay from the UN's Commission on AIDS about the progress being made in the fight against HIV.
Well, this has been a game-changing year, and that's what comes out in the report. We're seeing a major wave of strong political leadership as far as responding to the AIDS epidemic. We're seeing a lot of new scientific breakthroughs, both on the treatment side and on the prevention side. And we're seeing good results. We're seeing declines in new infections and more people on treatment.
You call this a game-changing year. There are plenty of positives to come out of this report. For example, new HIV infections are at their lowest levels since 1997. In 2010, antiretroviral therapy has averted 700,000 AIDS-related deaths. What are the factors responsible for this progress?
We're seeing really two waves that seem to be responsible for this. We are seeing, particularly in Africa, which is still the hardest hit continent as far as the epidemic, is behavior change, ongoing decreasing risks in behavior. And that means wearing condoms, not having as many sexual partners, and for young people, it means not starting sex at too young an age. What's happening on top of that is that as we scale up treatment, what we're finding is something that we learned in the science and we knew theoretically from modeling, that more and more people who are on treatment become less infectious. So you don't see transmission of the virus, HIV, when somebody's on treatment. And that is now kicking in as sort of a double impact. So the treatment is saving lives, but also protecting newborns and people, sexual partners. That really is going to have a profound impact in the future.
We've talked about the positives, but the report also says that funding by donor states has reduced by 10% in the last year. But are you worried that the government is not taking this problem seriously enough?
Yeah, we are worried about it. In fact, the total monies available for AIDS flatlined 2 years ago and started to decline last year. We're at about $15 billion overall being spent in middle and low-income countries. And those declines have come from both the international donors and foundations and internal to countries that are affected. And one of the things that comes out in this report is how can countries spend the amount that they have now in a much smarter way so that they get more impact.
Paul Delay ending that report by Aditya Mehta about the progress being made in the fight against HIV. To Zimbabwe now, and more than 1 million people in that country need food assistance between now and next March. That's according to the World Food Programme. They warn that poor families and households with orphans and vulnerable children are most at risk. The agency and its partners are providing assistance in the form of cash transfers and food vouchers, but they need $42 million to continue their work. The WFP's Deputy Director in Zimbabwe, Simon Camelbeek, told Derek Mabarthur there is also an income crisis in the southern African country.
People just don't have adequate resources to access food. Although it is available on the market, they are not capable to buy the food, what they need. We talk about the seasonal need. This need is only until the end of March when we expect the new crop to come in. So it's to bridge the deficit of about 1 million people for the coming 4 to 5 months.
Between now and March?
Yeah.
Now, why are they not able to produce food, enough food?
They are living in an area where food production is already a challenge. There were also these same areas were much affected by a dry spell, which occurred early this year in February. So although the expectation was high that they would produce much more food, then this dry spell came in about 4 to 5 weeks, very much affected the maize crop, but also the other small grains like sorghum and millet.
Is there a threat of famine in Zimbabwe?
Now, famine, I would say, it's too much to say. As I said, it's only for a couple of months that people will need this assistance. But we have seen reports of very distressed people in those areas who don't manage to mobilize enough money from either selling animals or other assets to cater for their needs. But it will definitely have a major impact on the nutritional status of the most vulnerable, like the children and the elderly, and people who are already affected by HIV/AIDS.
Now, how are they coping with this situation right now?
They're very much depending on the assistance WFP and other organizations are trying to provide. And we are not planning to give only food, we're also planning to give cash or vouchers in those areas where people can access the cereals. Because as it stands now, we have adequate resources of pulses and veg oil till the end of March, but we're just missing the cereals.
Now, do you have cash that you can give to the people?
We have some resources for particularly the month of November and December, but we are extremely short of resources for January to March. So if we get a response now in getting contributions, then we can still fix the problem for January to March, but resources have to come through very fast.
Now, how are you going to be able to mobilize these resources? Are you making an urgent appeal?
We have done an appeal to our donors. We are, of course, also liaising with the government of Zimbabwe and see how we can jointly address this crisis. So we are trying to mobilize all our friends and see how we can get the resources as soon as possible.
Is the government of Zimbabwe capable of helping in this situation?
Now, as you know, the government is, of course, limited on cash resources, but there are some maize stocks in the strategic grain reserve of Zimbabwe, which we have requested if this could be released to contribute to reduce the situation in the rural area. So, yes, we are liaising with the government to come up with a joint strategy.
Now, what should be done in the long term to ensure food security in Zimbabwe? Is there anything that can be done?
I think a lot has already been done in 2009, at the time that the economy was dollarized and the markets were liberalized. So we can see a lot of food stocks coming in as we speak from countries like Malawi and Zambia, who have both a significant surplus of cereals. So that's a good development, but it's a food crisis, but it's particularly an income crisis. So we should look into the measures to enable people to generate an income in those rural areas. So we are looking particularly at projects which can improve the water availability through water harvesting techniques. We look at nutrition gardens. We look at introducing more drought-resistant crops. So there's a whole range of measures being implemented also by other stakeholders like the FAO and UNICEF. So the measures are being implemented, but it will take a bit of time before we can really say everybody in the rural areas is food secure.
That's the World Food Programme's Deputy Director in Zimbabwe, Simon Camelbeek there, warning about the looming food crisis in Zimbabwe. The relationship between Sudan and South Sudan needs urgent attention. That's according to the head of UN peacekeeping. Havela Sow says the two states need to settle outstanding issues involving their borders and oil revenue. Relations between Sudan and South Sudan have deteriorated in the last few days. Several bombs were dropped by the Sudan Armed Forces in South Sudan last Thursday. Mr. Ladsoud told Maha Fayek that both countries need to take confidence-building measures to improve ties.
Well, I think what needs the most urgent attention has to be the relationship between the Republic of Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. They have undergone a very major political process in deciding to separate, but beyond the very major and very significant decision to separate, they have now to work up sensible arrangements to solve the outstanding issues like the border, like the sharing of the oil revenue, like the issue of Abyei, and the mutual accusations each side is throwing at the other for supporting insurgents inside its territory. It is a matter of building confidence between the two capitals. The African Union under former President Thabo Mbeki is working very actively on it, and of course we support them. Let me add that during the same trip I also went to Addis Ababa because I wanted to show the importance I attach to the partnership between the United Nations and the African Union. We have to work hand in hand and always more, always better.
Let's come back to the situation on the ground, particularly in South Sudan. As you rightly said, South Sudan and the UN mission in South Sudan accuse the Sudan Armed Force of airstrikes on refugee camp. Sudan Army denies bombing South Sudan and says UNMISS is being biased. How do you respond to those accusations?
Well, I think these accusations must be investigated, and indeed we have asked UNMISS to look into these matters. What I would say at this stage, at least in one instance, bombing took place in the camp of Yida, and we have witnesses from the force who happened to be precisely in that camp of refugees when the bombing took place.
What do you think needs to be done to diminish the tension between both countries?
I think, as I said, it is a matter of building confidence and helping them to do that. So there are a number of measures which are suggested to both parties by the African Union high-level implementation panel, by the United Nations, and we must keep on building this.
Do you think, Mr. Latsous, a solution towards the split of oil revenues would lessen the tension between the two countries, and where do the negotiations stand on this front?
There have been various proposals made. I believe they are being considered by both sides. I think nobody denies that Khartoum needs part of the financial resources which come from the oil. So now it's a matter of reaching an agreement between the two on this.
How do you assess your relationship with the government of Khartoum?
We have to work with the government of Khartoum because we have the mission in Darfur, UNAMID, we have a mandate to implement, and this supposes that we have the support, the help of the Sudanese government.
Actually, the security situation is worsening in Darfur, and peacekeepers are being targeted and killed. How would civilians be protected by UNAMID while the mission is struggling to secure its own peacekeepers?
I would say the situation is contrasted. It is true that there have been very serious incidents with several dead amongst the peacekeepers, but globally in Darfur over the last year, the situation security-wise has somewhat improved. It is fragile, but there have been less incidents, less attacks on internally displaced persons, less carjackings, less hostage-taking, so we have to hope that this trend will continue.
You spoke with the civilians when you visited some camps in Darfur. What did they tell you? What do they need?
Those I saw really would very much want to return to their place of origin. And indeed, we are helping several thousand of them to do precisely that, to return to their place and to resettle in their life.
Hervé Lassour, head of UN Peacekeeping, speaking there with Maha Fayek. In the US, a newly released guide for use by healthcare professionals is helping identify children and teenagers at risk of alcohol-related problems. Dr. Vivian Faden is with the National Institutes of Health, who assisted with producing the guide, along with the American Academy of Pediatrics, clinical researchers and other health practitioners. Dr. Faden, this guide is rather unique in that by asking just 2 questions, kids at risk of alcohol abuse can be identified.
The new guide introduces a 2-question screening tool and an innovative youth alcohol risk estimator. The idea is that we help clinicians overcome the time constraints and other common barriers that keep them from doing as much youth alcohol screening as we would like.
How do you identify the risk with just 2 questions?
The 2 questions being asked, one asks about personal drinking frequency and the other asks about friends drinking. They vary slightly for elementary, middle, and high school ages. So the question on friends drinking, which is the first question asked of the younger kids, might be like this. do you have any friends who drank beer, wine, or any drink containing alcohol in the past year? And then that might be followed by this. How about you? In the past year, on how many days have you had more than a few sips of beer, wine, or any drink containing alcohol?
And how are these questions important within your screening process?
It's important to ask both of these questions because the friends drinking question is an early warning signal, and it's a very good predictor of future drinking. The personal drinking question, or the frequency question, is the best predictor of current risk for problems from current drinking in adolescents who are already drinking.
That's Dr. Vivian Faden, who hopes that a new guide for healthcare workers will develop new interventions for underage drinkers. Now, research has shown that over the course of adolescence, the proportion of youth who have had more than just a few sips of alcohol increases dramatically from 7% in 12-year-olds to nearly 70% of 18-year-olds in the US. To West Asia now, where farmers are being encouraged to try new crop varieties in an attempt to cope better with climate change and burgeoning populations. Experts have been meeting in Kuwait to discuss how best to respond to this decline. Daniel Dickinson asked Dr. Manava Sivakumar from the World Meteorological Organization how a strategy can be developed for a region with such large disparities in wealth.
There are income inequalities among these countries, but in terms of ecology, they're all covered by the fragile ecosystems of semi-arid and arid regions. So they have the same sort of challenges in terms of water scarcity, drought, land degradation, and desertification. And of course, there is a significant increase in population in this entire region because something like 2.5% annual growth rate. And more than 70% of the poor in this region, they live in the rural areas.
What strategies are you suggesting?
We are suggesting adaptation strategies that include changing the crop varieties, making more efficient use of water, scheduling cropping activities more appropriately as per the rainfall patterns, adopting more effective pest and disease control practices, and also using risk insurance schemes as well. There are seasonal climate forecasts that are available these days, and they could probably use those more efficiently to reduce the production risk.
How quickly can farmers in these regions adapt to climate change?
One, of course, would say that it's a long-term process, but we are placing a lot of emphasis on policy and institutions and coordination among the various agencies. Whenever you have these fragile ecosystems, it's very important to have an effective policy. The other issue, of course, is, the entire issue of capacity building. You have to strengthen the ability to collect data on climate, crops, livestock, fisheries, analyze these data correctly, and also use appropriate modeling. We also need to increase the investment, both the public and private investment into this climate change adaptation.
How does the information actually affect change in the field?
One of the effective ways is to really have community participation. We have been doing these sort of activities in West Africa through what we call roving seminars on weather and climate for farmers. So in these seminars, what we do is we bring together farmers from groups of villages into one central location for one day. During the first part of the day, we inform them about weather and climate in the region, the various crops and cropping systems, and how weather impacts these crops. And then we inform them also about what kind of meteorological information can be conveyed to them through long-range and short-range forecasts and so on. And then in the afternoon, we encourage the farmers to give us the feedback. Do they really have a good understanding of climate change and its impacts on their crops and cropping systems? What kind of information do they require for them to be able to adapt quickly? And whether they understand the forecasts that the meteorological departments issue. Another thing we have been doing in these seminars is we have been distributing rain gauges to farmers, very simple, inexpensive rain gauges. So we demonstrate to them how to collect rainfall, how to use the information in decision making. For example, when to plant, when to apply fertilizer, when to take action for pesticides and disease control and so on.
Dr. Manava Sivakumar there from the World Meteorological Organization. In Kenya's Turkana district, the number of girls enrolled in school is very low. That's according to UNICEF. Teen pregnancy, early marriage and poverty are just some of the main obstacles they face. Insecurity is another, which is why parents are reluctant to allow their daughters to trek long distances to go to school. But as Jocelyn Sambira reports, efforts are being made to encourage girls to attend class.
Sheila Lokupu from a remote village in northwestern Kenya's Turkana district used to walk 5 kilometers every day to attend school. But at 13, when her father died, money became tight. There was not enough money for food and school supplies. Shortly after, Sheila fell pregnant and had to drop out of school. But 2 years on, she wants to focus on getting an education.
The reason why I returned to school is that I'm hoping that when I finish school and secure a job, I can help my mother, my child, and all of my siblings.
Sheila is Loa Lokupu's eldest daughter. Loa sells bundles of wood to eke out a living. Since becoming a widow, she's taken up the sole responsibility of providing for her children. To allow Sheila to go back to school, Loa has offered to look after her grandchild.
Now, since she has gone back to school, I'm asking her to work hard and not to repeat the same mistake again. I'm asking her not to take her education lightly.
Napu Primary School has had its fair share of teenage pregnancies, causing many girls to drop out. Early marriages are also a common obstacle for the girls who want to seek an education. It takes great courage and commitment for young mothers like Sheila to return to school, leaving their children at home to concentrate on their studies. For many, this is an impossible feat. Gabriel Ekale is the head teacher of Napu Primary.
The issue of pupils dropping out of school, especially girls, has been brought out by the factor of poverty, which is affecting almost all families in Turkana.
To promote girl education and make it a priority in Turkana, UNICEF and the African Girls Initiative are supplying beds, mattresses, bed sheets, and mosquito nets. The Kenyan government has also cut down on boarding expenses. They want to make sure that girls like Sheila finish their education and make a difference in their lives.
Jocelyn Sambira reporting. Now to Afghanistan, where Afghan leaders, officials and diplomats met in a 2,000-strong meeting to discuss the future relationship of Afghanistan with the international community after ISAF forces step aside in 2014. Ruth Owen is in Afghanistan and filed this report.
At a 2,000-strong gathering of Afghan leaders, President Karzai reaffirmed the importance of Afghanistan's partnership with the international community up to and beyond 2014, when it's planned that most of ISAF's forces would step aside for Afghans to take control of security. He endorsed a strategic partnership with the United States, the biggest contributor of military forces to the country, but emphasized that Afghan sovereignty was paramount and highlighted sensitive issues such as detention centers and night raids on Afghan homes for discussion at this mass meeting. Over the 4-day jirga, delegates took part in a number of discussion committees and overwhelmingly backed calls for the long-term security pact with the US past 2014. But they too emphasised conditions on night operations and on the number of international troops stationed in any bases left behind that would continue to train and support Afghan security forces. President Karzai also reaffirmed the government's commitment to the peace process, a crucial move after the assassination of the head of the Peace Council, Burhanuddin Rabbani, in September. However, he emphasised that talks with the insurgents would only happen with the approval and advice of the Afghan people. The Loya Jirga is an ancient traditional meeting of leaders from all over the country. Its findings do not have a legal base, but are rather used to advise the president on future decisions. This incarnation was marked by a higher number of women, making up 18% of the entire gathering. The Taliban had threatened to kill anyone who took part, but with tight security from Afghan forces, cleared roads and a 4-day holiday called, Kabul was quiet and secure. Having been presented with 41 committees worth of views, President Karzai will take time now to consider Afghanistan's position and take the next step in carving out the country's place in the world beyond 2014.
Ruth Owen in Afghanistan there, reporting on the leadership's view of life in their country after 2014. Now, before we go, a mention of the violence that has erupted against protesters in Egypt this week. Mayana Kaye is an expert on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association and says Egyptians have been denied their right to peaceful assembly by the Egyptian authorities. He's speaking with Jerry Adams.
We've been seeing Egyptians coming out to exercise their right of peaceful assembly and peaceful protests, and this right is being restricted. And so our concern is that the Egyptian government should respect the right of peaceful protest and peaceful assembly, which is international human rights that the government of Egypt has subscribed to and has accepted. So our concern is that the events of the last few days are of worry to us that the government of Egypt may not be respecting that fundamental right of peaceful protest and peaceful assembly that is guaranteed under international human rights law.
And you have called on, you and a group of United Nations independent experts are calling on Egyptian authorities to stop using violence. What has been the response?
We haven't got a response yet from the Egyptian government, but we're a bit optimistic because the government of Egypt has reiterated that it does believe that people of Egypt have a right to peacefully protest, which is a step forward, so that there are ways in which one can police peaceful protests that without necessarily resorting to such violence and force, because that is when then you can have deaths. And I think one of my colleagues, the special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, has raised concern about the level of violence that could have an impact to extrajudicial executions, which are not permitted by international law. So we're calling on the government of Egypt not to resort to the old tactics. We're calling upon the government of Egypt to also respect the rights of association, because beyond the protest, there's also been allegations that have reached us about the way the government is trying to restrict non-governmental organizations and other civil society organizations in terms of how they are organizing themselves. There have been issues and reports received by us of groups that are being undermined as they try and organize. They're being followed and surveillance is happening. And we're calling upon the government of Egypt to reflect really the spirit of the Arab Spring that happened this year, which was a cry for freedom and a cry for space, and to, in a sense, keep that spring going and not turn it into a harsh, cold winter.
Now, how does this all relate to the elections, the upcoming elections?
The elections are an important step forward for Egypt, and the right to associate and the right to dissent even, as long as that dissent is done peacefully, is a fundamental one, so that people of Egypt can then choose their own government, people of Egypt can then decide how they want to be governed and how they want to move forward, and the only way to do that in a manner that is sensible and reasonable is if they have the right to associate and the right to assemble and the right to express their views whenever they can, and that those people who are human rights defenders, who are at the forefront of pushing this and leading this on, are given the space to be able to do so.
What is the situation now?
I'm now in South Africa, and I've been following this quite closely. I'm not quite sure what the numbers are right now, and we're working closely with some people on the ground, NGOs, also the UN office, and other people who are giving us information. So I can't tell you right now how many have died and how many have been injured. But I think we've all seen on our TVs the level of violence that's been going on, the amount of tear gas has been thrown at the protesters, the use of hard rubber bullets has been used. And these are things of concern, because you don't have to do that in terms of policing a peaceful protest. It's when you come out with force that people then turn a bit violent, and we don't want to encourage that at all.
Mayana Kai discussing the recent violence in Egypt. And that is The World for this week. If you want to learn more about the program or wish to make a contribution to the show, then please do visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. The World is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale, and we hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch at www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I certainly look forward to your company next time. Until then, bye for now.